appreciation and our gratitude and to welcome you here to the Botanical Garden tonight. And the format for the evening is that we'll have about 45 minutes or so for our speaker to talk, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A after. So if you have questions, hold on to them. We will come around with microphones so that we can hear your questions. And then after that, there's a book signing opportunity at the gift shop. And the gift shop is located right at the exit to the garden. And we have copies there of The Asking. Of course, if you brought your own copy of a book here tonight, you can bring that as well. And that will happen at 8 o'clock. So the restrooms, also I want to point out, they're right here. The nearest ones are behind me in the courtyard. If you haven't already, just take a moment, please, to silence cell phones so that we have an uninterrupted talk. Tonight's speaker is an award-winning poet, translator, and essayist. In poems described by the Washington Post as belonging among the masters, and in the New York Times Magazine as among the most important poetry in the world today, she addresses the urgent immediacies of our time, ranging from the political, the ecological, the scientific, to the metaphysical, personal, and passionate. She praises the radiance of particularity and reckons the consequences of the daily. Her poems and essays traverse the crisis of the biosphere, questions of social justice, and the myriad interior quandaries of the heart, mind, and spirit. Her work lives at the intersection of facts and imagination, desire and loss, impermanence and beauty, all the dimensions of our shared existence within what one poem calls the pure democracy of being. Please join me in welcoming Jane Hirshfield.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction. I would like to thank the Atlanta Haiku Festival and the Botanical Garden. And I also want to say that I hope it was clear to you that I am not here tonight basically giving a poetry reading of my own work. I am here talking about what the description in the events calendar said I would be, which is primarily not my own work. But, you know, I can think of, and I also, if you notice that I appear to be reading, I am. I have a lifelong terrible memory, and in order to say what I want to say, I write everything. But I'll try to look up from time to time. There can't be a better place to talk about the thing tonight, which is how we think, feel, and write in collaboration with the natural worlds, shapes, beings, singings, and seasonal changes, than in a place that preserves, instructs, and presents so beautifully the biosphere's own plenitudes of wildly creative invention. And I mean wildly in both that word's senses. There are many ways that a person can take in a botanical garden's offerings, and each way of looking changes what you can see and how you see. You can walk through a botanical garden like a gardener. You can walk through it with the eyes of a traveler. I saw that plant in its native home. With the curiosity of a scientist, a historian, a sculptor, a painter. You can walk simply as someone who loves to be amazed by the exuberance of existence. You can walk with the eyes of a science fiction writer or a poet. When you look with the eyes and the intentions of poetry, and this, of course, is not only about the visual, we are beings who hear, touch, eat, and follow a scent as well, you're seeing with all of those other ways of looking that I talked about, with the entirety of your own human life, and with your own memories, hopes, associations, and imagination. When you look with the eyes of a poet, you are also looking sometimes, or perhaps unconsciously, and yet you still are, with a question, an invitation. You are looking, thinking, is there a poem here of some kind, you know? And if there is, what might it want to be saying, finding seeing. Poems see in ways that are multiple and are multiplying. They look outward and inward at the same time, and they bring past, present, and future into one moment's fully inhabited holding. And by bringing all of that together, they find a way to see more. And by putting it into words, they find a way that you might perhaps be able to see it again. So I'm going to hope that those of you who, I also had no idea who the audience was going to be or what you were coming thinking you were going to hear. And I'll just say that if you're here because you write haiku, I hope you won't mind that a lot of this talk is going to meander earlier and later. What I decided to say when I began writing this surprised even me. So I'll be talking about haiku, but I'll be talking about the earlier form of the Japanese poetry was written in, and I will be giving you a tiny sample of my own work before it ends, because that was also in the description. And what they all will share is haiku's relationship to the way of looking at and looking with plants and animals, objects, actions, and seasons, can let these things both become their selves more fully and radiantly and saturated with their own being, and also become an invitation into some new human thought, emotion, feeling, perception, meaning. So the first example, and don't worry that I'm going to stay with this for a long time, this is one of two main examples. This is a poem that was written in the 9th century by a Japanese poet, Ono no Kamachi, who was considered one of classical era Japan's 6 immortals in poetry. This pine tree by the rock must have its memories too. After 1,000 years, see how its branches lean toward the ground. So this poem in form is a tanka. That was the form Japanese poetry was written in for 1,000 years before haiku came into being. And tanka are in the Japanese 31 syllables. And for any of you who are objecting to the word syllables, yes, I know the Japanese way of counting called on is a little different than English language syllables, but that's what I'm going to say. You have to wonder, 31 syllables, 5 lines usually in English when it's written out. Do you really need a form that is shorter than that? Because haiku simply became the main form of Japanese poetry in that country, and also the worldwide one that was adopted. It doesn't seem as if the missing 14 syllables or extra 14 syllables would make that much of a difference, and yet they really do. And I'll be coming back to that later to try to say more about it. But the first thing that I wanted to say is, why this poem? Why did I bring you this poem? And it is because it is such a clear example of the main thing that I'm talking about tonight. Looking outward at an actual pine tree and inward at a human life. At the same time, as it looks at the pine tree, it speaks the experience of the person writing the poem. And I am going to be bringing this out as we go on. There is a kind of kinesthetic mirroring when you look at almost anything and you take in what it is and what it could mean or say. And that happens in this poem. Things have their knowledge and carry their feeling of what's it like to be that. There's the famous psychological paper, what is it like, philosophical paper, what is it like to be a bat? And no one knows what it's like to be a bat. And yet, you look at a bat and you feel something about being that creature. So, what is it like to be in the condition of leaning? You know, almost everyone I know right now feels their life is out of balance, being blown by strong winds. The world's news every day can feel like an unceasing hurricane. And I think that's another reason that I chose this particular poem as the one to talk about. I want to tell you just a little bit about Ono no Komachi. So her place in Japanese poetry is parallel to the place of Sappho in the poetry of the West. Both women wrote at a time when writing itself had just been made available. It hadn't been around very long in Greece or in Japan. Both helped shape what a lyric poem itself would go on to be. They were influential poets. Both were very early in bringing the experience of eros directly into poetry. Both are counted still to this day amongst the world's greatest writers, and both were recognized for that greatness while they were alive. Komachi was a poet strongly of eros, but also equally fully a poet of Buddhist understanding. And she was also a kind of proto-feminist figure. The story we have about her, much of which is, legendary. She lived too early for us to have documents about her life. But she was supposed to have been not only the greatest poet of her time, but the most beautiful of women. And once you learn more about Japanese culture, you understand that's why she was considered the most beautiful of women, was because she was a great poet, which is kind of interesting. Less about bone structure and more about deep structure. But she ended her life. You would go to court and be a companion to the imperial family as a young woman. You were educated. You had a great deal of freedom. A family could raise its status by a daughter marrying well. And so for these families in the aristocratic ranges, women were very valuable and they were treated well and had lives of great independence. But unlike the story of most of the women who did this, she didn't marry a provincial governor and go off and live in the countryside. The stories we have of Komachi in her old age, she is an anonymous old hag, that's the word it's usually translated as, living in poverty in a thatched hut outside the walls of the city. Nobody knows who she is, nobody knows who she was. There were rumors around that she might know something about poetry, and one of the no plays written about her, 600 years after she died, shows her encountering some Buddhist monks on a mountain trail. She's sitting on a tree stump. They yell at her for sitting on a sacred Buddha, and they have a dialogue about this. What does it mean to be sacred in Buddhist understanding? And the monks end up saying to her, yeah, you're right. This was wrong of us. So this is a great deal of why her story is so interesting. It's so unusual. The poem that I've given you isn't one of her most famous, but it's one of the ones that I think about and remember. And for me, this is one of the signs of what I think of as, I'm pretty open about saying great poem. A poem that comes back to me that I think of again and again over years, that's almost definitional for me of what makes a poem great, that it serves again and again. I read the poem first when I was very young and was deeply moved by it. I read it now when I am not so young and am deeply moved by this intimate encounter of an old woman and a tree. So now we're going to walk through it together and kind of look at how this moment's meaning is made in this poem. And I hope it clarifies the poem, but also it's meant to serve as an example for how that happens in any poem that works in this way of seeing an image of the natural world and then seeing more. I do want to acknowledge, I'm talking about the poem in English translation. So this close reading I'm doing is not of the original poem. I would be saying probably very different things if I were talking about it in Japanese, but this is the poem that we have. So the first line, this pine tree by the rock. The words summon an image. Most of us are going to know what a pine tree is, and just about every human being on earth knows what a rock is. We see the shapes, sense the textures, perhaps the scent of the pine tree comes to mind, and neuroscientists have discovered that if you tell somebody to think about an orange, the olfaction area of the brain lights up and the taste buds get larger, ready to eat a slice of orange. So this all becomes part of a kind of subliminal awareness that happens when you read a poem. Usually not conscious unless you have to put together a talk describing what you think is the experience when you read that poem, and then you can make it conscious. So reading a poem, one thing that happens is that awareness, I'm reading a poem, you have a kind of telescopic radar array that is looking for certain things that it turns to poetry to find. And so your subliminal mind is saying, why is this being said and not something else? What am I meant to take from it? Where are we going? These words and I. Why give your time to it when there's so much else clamoring for your attention? All of that is going on in the back of your mind. In my own subliminal awareness of this poem, both a rock and a pine tree last longer than a human life does, if they're allowed to, but a rock lasts longer than a pine tree. It is literally the ground of our lives. It takes place, our lives take place on it, they return to it. A rock holds deep time. A leaning pine tree is a lot more like us. It is vulnerable to time, to weather, to wounding by events and choices. Pine trees are mortal. And what lasts and what is impermanent is something that comes to mind to me with this image of the leaning pine tree over the rock. And our mortality is something that we often prefer not to look directly at. If we thought about our mortality all of the time, we might not be quite so functional, depending on our relationship to it. But we turn to poems to be able to bear what is hard to not forget. And so we're helped in our sense of connection. We're helped by the perception of beauty. Life becomes worthwhile. We need a way to say yes to the whole story of being alive in what is, after all, a very momentary existence. And to look directly at the joy and the terrifying predicament of being alive, vulnerable, and transient, we need meaning. And that comes to us sometimes in art, in poems, singing, stories, and in a botanical garden. Also, by being in this moment, in the poem's first word, we're brought into a this moment experience. This isn't some general pine tree. It is this pine tree by the rock, this one. And speaking of a person who is in the present and a tree who is in the present, that small word is a cue that places you in a certain relationship to what is happening in the poem. It is the speaking of a person who knows a particular tree and knows that she is with it and is here. We only say this of the present. We say that when we're speaking about a tree elsewhere, a tree remembered. It's, remember that tree? We don't say, hey, remember this tree from when we were young? Unless the tree is still here. So I imagine you can feel the difference. And one of the magic tricks made by language is the way that reading Komachi's poem, you're brought into the experience with her right now. To inhabit the word this is to have already come inside the poem's opened door. That was a lot of time on this. So, this pine tree by the rock must have its memories too. So those of you who came here because you write haiku might be surprised by that poem's second line. Classical haiku doesn't speak of something as abstract as memory. There's no time for it, and that's not how they work. Usually, and there are always exceptions, haiku create meaning through image and response, or image and second image. See this, see that. Put them next to each other and something new, not said before, is heard and is felt. Traditional haiku, of course, also have what is called a kigo, a word indicating what season it is. And sometimes you're naming the season, and sometimes you're just naming something that only happens in a particular season. So crickets are associated with autumn. If I talked about the blooming tulip poplar that I was just looking at a few minutes ago, you would know that it is spring. In Komachi's poem, you have no idea what season it is. And that's a difference between tanka and haiku. And I will add that bringing into each poem some subliminal or explicit naming of season works exactly the same way this does. It brings you here, wherever that here is. It places the poem in a specific moment in time. Haiku are immediate, and they happen in the now. Okay, big liberty here. I decided to see what would happen if I tried to rewrite Komachi's poem as a haiku. And my hope is that she would forgive me for doing this because she would be so delighted to know that her poem was being talked about over 1,000 years after it was written in a different language and in a distant place. So apologies to Komachi. I don't think it's an especially great haiku. It was just me trying to run an experiment. Deep autumn, on a rock, a green pine tree leaning. Deep autumn, on a rock, a green pine tree leaning. Very different poems, but also some of the meaning they carry is the same, even when I made a change, and I will be coming back to that. Going back to her poem, This Pine Tree by the Rock Must Have Its Memories Too, I wanted to notice that too, which in Japanese is the little word mo. The earlier this conveys a particular person is present, speaking of a tree and rock that they know. The two confirms and expands that. That single, again, very slight word tells us that the person saying the poem feels themselves within what they see in the tree. Poet and tree are one, are the same. They share the shape and they share the circumstances that their separate fates have brought them to become. An aside. There is a really long tradition in contemporary American poetry of condemning anthropomorphism. You're not supposed to put human feelings or stories into non-human creatures or objects. And many literary critics have trained themselves to condemn the gesture instantly anytime they see it as sentimental, arrogant, and newest literary term, cringe. The art critic, visual art critic, John Ruskin, gave it the name pathetic fallacy when you place human feelings into non-human things. And what an effective phrase of condemnation. No one wants to be pathetic and nobody wants to be wrong, even though he simply meant pathetic as a synonym for feeling. But these days it's a harsh criticism. But then, 2,000 years before Ruskin, Aristotle praised this way of describing things, and he called it the animating principle. Now, isn't that much nicer, the animating principle? It's pretty native to how we are as human beings. Children imbue stuffed animals and stick figure dolls with life, and we feel our emotions, thoughts, and fates in everything we live amidst and with. Think of Shakespeare's storm in King Lear. It's just what we do. It is how we think. It is how we evolved to understand what we look at as significant and signifying. And part of this is because there is no other material to have made language and thought and named experience out of. And I will just recommend to any of you who want to follow up on this, there is a marvelous book by the linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. And it talks about why we are so disposed to see growth and more as good, and light as better than its lack. Just the physical experience of seeing plants live and seeing them die. When you say of your beloved who has just seen you through a great crisis, they were my rock, that means something to you because you know what a rock is. A rock doesn't leave you. A rock doesn't change. A rock can be relied on. I also want to add that in Japan's traditional Shinto culture, the separating of human and natural worlds, or the separating of the sacred and the natural, as in that no play that I described earlier, it simply doesn't exist. It didn't exist. And on the other side, we do want to remember how much we don't know, even about other people's lives, let alone what it's like to be a bat. Part of the great success of haiku and tanka poems in not setting off this reaction of, ooh, that's really sentimental and cringe, is the great tactfulness with which this is enacted. It also happens in traditional Chinese poems. The meaning making is implicit, often unspelled out. And so I just want to change that rule of don't anthropomorphize to don't anthropomorphize rudely, stupidly, or disrespectfully. We should know that if a pine tree suffers, it probably doesn't suffer as we do. But whether or not it suffers is an open question still. The scientists keep working around the edges of that. But also the meaning we take from a poem isn't less real because we know we put it in there and created it. That's what art is for. A poem exists for us. The tree won't mind. The tree won't say, how can she say that about me? My life had no suffering in it. And also, what we call memory, when you look at that tree in the poem, the part of the tree that has taken the shape of its trunk, its bark, its roots, and its branches, that is the evidence of actual weight, actual winds, actual physics. It is a kind of memory, the shape that a tree ends up in. It is the story of its life. Okay, back to the poem, and now we're going to get to its second half. The pine tree by the rock must have its memories too. After 1,000 years, see how its branches lean toward the ground. Tanka, like haiku, are made by two juxtaposed gestures of mind. Not always, but mostly. In this tanka's second gesture, first we're given the explicit awareness of time, which is named in our human ways of counting it, after 1,000 years. Then we also have something else. Reading them, it's a poem. The meaning and the reason that it moves us may not be paraphrasable, yet I hope you felt them each time I have said this poem. There's also the word see. With that word, once again, the presence of human noticing is summoned into a poem that if you were reading it, casually, superficially, too quickly, you might think it was just describing a tree. But the reader told to see is summoned into the poem also. And all of these small cues, this pine tree, to see, are how we know that this is a poem that thinks about something more than only a tree. Not to be disrespectful to the tree by saying only. It's also about the person who looks at and describes it. The task of poetry is to augment how we find ourselves able to live. There's one story, and then there's a second. And the notes between the two, made by the two, become simultaneously in the mind a chord that carries its own meaning, music, and mood. You might notice that this tanka has no pronoun I in it, no grammatical voice. And in Japanese, you often don't need to specify first person, second person, third person. You just don't have to. But that doesn't mean it isn't clear. When I read this poem, I know at once it is personal. And in the description of a pine tree bending under time, winds, and its own weight, I know I am also seeing Komachi's own long and often difficult life. There's one more element of meaning in this poem, and that is the pine tree is still standing. The poet is still seeing, is still writing. And that awareness, unpointed out, is still there and is deeply part of the poem's full power. I want to go back for a moment to my remaking of it as a not-so-great haiku now, and I'm going to give it to you in a slightly different version because I tried it in a lot of versions just to see what the effect was. Deep autumn, the rock's leaning pine tree still green. So I tried this experiment in different ways to kind of see how much of the tanka's experience could be carried over into a haiku, and also because I wanted to basically illustrate the difference between the two forms. The kigo season word, deep autumn, in Japanese often is used to mean old age, the end of life. It can also be the conclusion of anything, including especially of a love affair. We know this, we feel this, because we have seen it year after year in our lives in the living world we share. This is what I mean when I talk about how broadly the understanding of Japanese and Chinese poetry of image is, why it is not as difficult to translate as some other poems, why we feel like we understand them even if we can't spell it completely out, is because we know what autumn is, just as we knew what a rock was. My invented haiku, I think, is less good because it's much more general. It's not this pine tree. It's not It hasn't got that to that indicates it's the viewer's life. You could, deep autumn, the rocks leaning, pine trees still green. One lover could have sent that to another lover to say, you might be gone, but I'm still here. That's a valid interpretation of the tanka. You wouldn't hear of the haiku, and you would not hear that possibility in Komachi's tanka, which I think is I told it to be quiet. I don't know why my phone doesn't. I turned down the sound and it still does this. Why? Stop. I mean, it turns itself back on. I'm sorry. And it used to be nobody ever called me, but now all the politicians seem to call me. I'm very popular with the politicians. Okay, so I think I've covered that paragraph. Now I'm finally going to get to the haiku, the very famous haiku that gave this talk its title, if any of you noticed its title. It's by Basho, the 17th century poet, who basically created the haiku form as it is now practiced. And I could tell you the whole story about how that happened, but I've already written it down. And if anybody wants to know more about Basho's haiku, about how he came to create this form and continue to develop it over his lifetime, you can either go online, and for 99 cents you can buy the Kindle single ebook of it, which I did not title this. They titled it The Heart of Haiku, it is claiming, or under a different title, but basically the same piece, is in my own book of essays, 10 Windows, and none of my books other than my own selected poems is in the gift shop. I'm sorry about that. If I had chosen, I would have given you the poems that these books come from. Komachi's poem comes from a book called The Ink Dark Moon, which has her poems and then the poems of the other great woman writer of classical Japan. So anyhow, if you want to know more, there are other places where I talk at length, and I didn't want to duplicate what's in those books. So Basho left a really large body of work. He wrote haiku, he wrote journals that mix haiku and prose, describing the 4 long trips he took around Japan, which he did both to see the famous places of classical Japanese poetry, and also he was teaching, which isn't always in the major travel journals. It's not so clear how much he was teaching. But if Basho lived today, he's the one who would have flown here to talk about haiku, except he would have come by foot or by horseback. He went on these several 100-mile journeys wearing Buddhist robes. He studied Zen seriously, decided not to become a priest, but if you walked in Buddhist robes, the potential robbers would know that you had no money and leave you safely to pass. So what is in the West probably his most famous haiku? Old pond, frog leaps in, splash. And that word splash would be more literally translated sound of water, but in the Japanese, saying sound of water sounds like plop. It sounds like the frog going into the water. So I knew about this poem for a really long time before it truly opened its meaning to me. Even when I'd heard that meaning, because people have written about this poem a lot, I didn't really feel it. And this is true of many, many poems over a lifetime. A poem is just words. You don't know what all the fuss is about, and then one day, suddenly, it becomes three-dimensional, and you get it. I also had this happen very clearly one time looking at a Jackson Pollock painting. I had not understood why people liked Jackson Pollock paintings, and I was staring at one in a museum quite late in my life. Well, not now, but then it felt late in my life, and suddenly it became three-dimensional for me, and I understood why that painting mattered. So as I talk about this poem, don't worry if it doesn't change your relationship to the world today. That's okay. At some point in the future, maybe it will, maybe it won't. So, old pond, frog leaps in, splash. So I said earlier that haiku are different from tanka, that tanka often have a story you can intuit behind the given worlds. You intuit Komachi's life reading her poem. And haiku can do that, but it's much rarer. Usually a haiku is presenting something more like an epiphany, a flash of understanding. Some are profound, some are funny. A funny one that I didn't put into this talk is the poet Isa. Don't worry, spider, I keep house casually. Needed an example of that. Yes, like all poems, they are probably autobiographical. It is something the poet saw, it is something the poet responds with, but they usually don't tell the story of anything around themselves. And what they catch in their 17 syllables is a perception which is usually quite fundamental and recognizable to anyone who has ever had it, and sometimes revelatory to someone who hasn't. The worldviews truly are different between these two types of poetry, and they're also different between human beings. What is moving to one person is meaningless to another. Okay, back to the poem. Old pond, frog leaps in, splash. It is a little insult to actual experience to paraphrase and talk about. Sorry, I present you when I talk about these poems with a kind of second-hand plotting version or a desiccated ghost, and yet, for some reason, it sometimes helps. So, the old pond, you might think of as something a little bit like the way I was describing the rock in Komachi's poem. It is the ground of existence. It is vastness. It is the original world. It's the story that existed before and will exist after the story of our own individual life with its events, perceptions, arguments, ego, opinions. The old pond, silent and undisturbed, is somehow entirely outside of time. And some of you might have had experiences of feeling this directly. It's a falling into a largeness that is both you and also not at all you. But that's not the poem. Poems, something happens in poems. And in this world where everything changes moment to moment, even that old pond's great stillness doesn't get to just go on and on and on. The frog jumps in. And you can really hear this as pretty comic. Oh, I was sitting here feeling really large and outside of time, and I'd fallen into vastness. And a frog? Funny-looking creature with big eyes and weird hind legs. But sometimes it sings. So what happens when the frog interrupts the water? The poem says, and the world says, splash. And if you feel that fully, especially if you happen to have spent a few decades sitting in Zen meditation in which your old pond awareness is interrupted again and again and again by your thoughts of a war, by someone driving past in a car with the radio turned really loud, by a mosquito biting you, by the bell telling you that the meditation period is over, by the person next to you sneezing. Sometimes there can be a different experience when that happens. Sometimes there's no difference between that deep, undisturbed pond and the frog. Silence and splash are the same. You don't have to be so attached to feeling calm. The chattering world, the world of grief, the world of anger, and the pond, one isn't good, one isn't bad. You just welcome them all with a warm heart. You welcome the funny frog interrupting. Most of the time, we think that's a plague, but it needn't always feel that way. You're trying to cook dinner, the phone rings, the baby cries, some delivery comes, you have to make a list for tomorrow's shopping, your parent or neighbor might be sick. So much of the time, we feel overwhelmed. But sometimes you feel splash, splash, splash. Water jumped into is still water, and ponds need their frog to sing. So that's my attempt to give you some of the sense that I came to have of that particular haiku. Now I'm just going to, we're in the speeded up part now. We've gone through the slow part. I'm just going to give you a number of poems by Basho, a number of haiku, and not say a whole lot about them, although I might say something. The first of them is the second poem that in the West, if people know any of Basho's poems, they probably know this one. Leafless branch, a crow settling, autumn dusk. And I could have used that as the example, but I like the frog and the splash. So, but here's some others. Listen to these. Cuckoo. Masters of haiku vanish. Even in Kyoto, hearing a cuckoo, I long for Kyoto. Roadside blooming mallow, eaten by my horse. Mist, rain, not seeing Fuji. An interesting day. That was written on a high pass that's famous for its view of Fuji, and he makes the effort, he climbs up there, he's worked really hard and can't see a thing. How admirable, a man who sees lightning without thought of Satori. So Satori is the experience of sudden Buddhist awakening, often described in terms of lightning. And, and Basho's saying, even better, what if you just see the lightning? Don't do anything to it. Don't make it yours. This road through autumn nightfall, no one walks it. Dusk, the temple bell falls quiet. Fragrance rises night-struck from flowers. This one he wrote to a student. Don't copy me like the second half of a cut melon. Silence. The cicada's cry soaks into stone. Horsefly among the blossoms. Don't eat it, friend sparrow. These last two were written during his final illness, and the last one is the last poem that he wrote. Deep autumn, my neighbor, what is he doing? And on a journey ill, dreams continue scouring exhausted fields. And the context of that one was he told his students who were gathered all around him on his deathbed, I should be thinking Buddhist thoughts, not writing poems. But he couldn't help himself. He just kept writing poems. Also about this poem, there's one very frustrating thing, which is he called his student in, said this poem to him, then called him back and said, I have a better version. And the student couldn't quite hear it, and we don't know what it was. So you can hear how varied these haiku are. Basho wrote very differently over the course of his life as he kept testing what this new form could do and how it could do it. And this quick, almost simultaneous looking outward and inward of haiku should not become a formula. You know, these don't sound like, you know, if you think classic haiku, they don't sound like that at all. They're so varied. I'm going to give you one other haiku just because I happen to love it. It's by a later, slightly haiku poet named Shiki. Shiki died quite young of tuberculosis. He had wanted desperately to be a baseball player, and he is the only poet in the world who has been inducted into a baseball hall of fame. So what he wrote: my obituary, loved poems, 8 persimmons. Isn't that great? So how am I doing for time? All right, we'll skip that paragraph. Sorry, if any of you want to know more about haiku and form and poetry in general, ask in the Q&A. So I was asked to bring some of my own poems into this session. And the poems that I write, they are very short, as short or some even shorter than haiku. I call them pebbles, and I want to make very clear they are not haiku. They are not bad haiku. They are not haiku missing an arm or a leg. They're doing something different. I wanted to find a hybrid form, but I also wanted the speed and distillation, which is so much a part of haiku's power. So just a little range of mine. And I do recommend to you, if you are interested, find the American Poetry Haiku Community, which they are writing remarkable poems that fulfill the spirit of haiku and bring it into the current moment. So this is just going to be, just as I just did with Basho, just a set of really short poems of mine. All of them see something and respond. Like moonlight seen in a well. Like moonlight seen in a well, the one who sees it blocks it. Mountain and mouse, both move, one only more slowly. Sonoma fire. Large moon, the deep orange of embers, also the scent. The griefs of others, beautiful at a distance. I sat in the sun. I moved my chair into sun. I sat in the sun, the way hunger is moved when called fasting. Obstacle. This body still walking. The wind must go around it. Okay, there were a few more, but I'm going to read you 2 others. One is a little longer and the other, and I'm going to skip the whole section about joy. Sorry, but okay, skip the rest of my poems and on to joy we go. You're not going to hear the poem about this very vest written when I saw this vest and went, suddenly the poem leapt at me. But okay. I had several places I knew I could close this because I often run over. And you're not going to hear Tsuruyuki's great paragraph about Japanese poetry, which could have replaced this whole talk. All right, sorry. Joy. Words that take the shape of poems are always happy, no matter what the subject matter or mood of the poem. There is some joy present, glimmering in poetry in exactly the way a teardrop glimmers. Poems aren't ordinary speech in the way that dance isn't ordinary movement. They have their conventions of, and I alluded to some of this in everything I skipped over, of music and form and of ways that recognize that they're poetry and the ways that a constraint has you thinking and speaking differently. A poem either follows rules strictly, the way traditional haiku do, or it wears some memory fragrance of the fact that poems have done that. A poem exists to seduce attention, to seduce extra intensities of attention and perception. And so you might think of the courtship of trumpeter swans, or the luminous Morse code of fireflies. If you've ever seen horses court, the neck arches, the tail turns into a high flag, and a walk becomes what you see in dressage when the rider is asking for a piaffe. It is a prance of glorious shape and proportion and looks completely unnatural, but all those movements come from natural movements that horses actually do. You could also think of the forms of the flowers that you can see here, stylized into flutes or opened into broad invitations, yellow, red, purple, pink, fragrant, anthered, ornate as an orchid, simple as a daisy or a beach rose. The forms of the flowering, evolutions, inventions of shapes and scent, and the answering shapes of the pollinating bodies or beaks or furred legs of the pollinators are, as much as poems are, a stylized language. And this brings a surplus happiness in exactly the way that poems do. Form and function come perfectly together, but there's also something extra. And any of you who have read Michael Pollan's earlier book, The Botany of Desire, will remember how he describes in it that flowers aren't just summoning bees with their scent and colors and landing pads. They have also summoned us. Because we find them beautiful, we carry them across the world. Who then is the gardener? The human or the flower? The human life or the poem? I've written a great many poems over my life, but I also know the poems that have written me. And if you've ever been changed by one, you know this in your own life too. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. We have time for just a few questions. And as a reminder, if you can raise your hand, we'll come to you with the microphone so that we can hear it in the room and also capture it on our live feed. Any questions? I scared you with the live feed bit, didn't I?
Yeah, I always leave people in a big Q&A mood when I give talks, but usually if someone has one, others will.
Thank you, Jane. That was so beautiful. I have a question about translation. I know Robert Hass had translated some of those, but I noticed a lot of them, the haiku, have like a kind of coy, sort of playful, mischievous tone to them in English. And I don't know any Japanese, but does that happen in the Japanese as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. And
Absolutely.
is it a similar kind of mischief, or does it feel slightly different, or is it the same kind?
Okay, well, one confession is, so all those Japanese poems that I read you, I co-translated with a Japanese native speaker. So I am not a fluent speaker of Japanese. I just loved the poems, and Mariko Aratani and I have worked together on both the earlier women and then on the Basho material. So, but we work together in a way where I have great access to the originals. And what you are trying to do when you translate is bring the whole poem across. Not just the literal words, but the feeling of the words, the meaning of the words, the intention you feel in the words. And so, yeah, Japanese poetry is very capable of humor, and especially haiku, because haiku began, this is part of that long story, it began as a kind of parlor game. It was originally amusing. It was like how the samurai would get together, and where now you might play Dragons and Dungeons, they had haiku parties. So humor in haiku is right there in its roots. Tanka, these women, so Ono no Komachi and then the other one, Izumi Shikibu in the Ink Dark Moon, what stunned me, because there were only about 6 of their poems available in English when I found out about them, and I waited 15 years for somebody who was fluent in both languages to do the book before Mariko and I did it. They could be really sarcastic. They could be very independent. You know, I had seen the poems of longing for the lover who doesn't come, but there are other poems in which they're saying, you know, this morning's garden filled with snow is far too lovely for footsteps to mar. Saying, you know, to hell with you. So, you know, poetry is the singing of human lives. And being funny is really restorative if you can find your way there. I wish my own poems were funnier. I was glad, you know, a couple of them y'all laughed at, and I was happy about that. I used to have 1 smile per book, and now I'm up to 7 chuckles. Anything else?
We have time for maybe one more question.
Oh, read the vest poem? Okay, I'll read you the vest poem. Boy, is it going to sound different. So the introduction to the vest poem was, I'm giving you one longer poem that it doesn't even really have, you know, if there's a mention of the natural world in it. Sorry, I let all my papers go completely out of order when I did this. But it is a poem that began with seeing something and then responding to seeing it. So I wanted to give you this one example of the way this happens in other kinds of poems. The poem goes all over the world. Every place it mentions poetry has taken me to. You know, it's not making this stuff up. It is amazing. I wear this vest so I don't have to carry a purse. It's a fisherman's vest. It's got, like, you know, 23 pockets. And you really can lose, you know, what did I put where, which one has my passport in it. But anyhow, I saw it over the back of a chair in the place where I was working, and suddenly I just wanted to sing back the way the frogs in the paragraph I didn't read you about Japanese poetry sing back to one another. Okay, so. Vest. I put on again the vest of many pockets. It is easy to forget which holds the reading glasses, which the small pen, which the house keys, the compass and whistle, the passport. To forget at last for weeks, even the pocket holding the day of digging a place for my sister's ashes, the one holding the day where soon enough someone will put my own. To misplace the pocket of touching the walls at Auschwitz would seem impossible. It is not. To misplace for a decade the pocket of tears. I rummage and rummage, transfers for Munich, for Melbourne, to Oslo, a receipt for a Singapore coffee, a device holding music, Bach, Garcia, Richter, Porter, Pärt. A woman, long dead now, gave me, when I told her I could not sing, a kazoo, now in a pocket. Somewhere, a pocket holding a Steinway. Somewhere, a pocket holding a packet of salt. Borgesian, vest, Oxford English Dictionary vest, with a magnifying glass tucked inside one snapped-closed pocket, Wikipedia vest, Rosetta vest, Enigma vest of decoding. How is it one person can carry your weight for a lifetime? One person slip into your open arms for a lifetime, who was given the world and hurried for tissues, for chapstick. So the difference in that poem, I'm just going to make the point that I was going to make about it, is 1,000 years from now, that poem will be incomprehensible. There are many people on Earth right now to whom its references would be incomprehensible. That is the difference between writing about cold rains and spring blossoms falling, and writing about Wikipedia and Borges's Ficciones and, you know, all of the things in this poem. They are not universally known the way a rock or a pine tree, I hope, will continue to be if this earth continues to be viable for anything like the biosphere we have been so lucky to be born into. But you have to write to your own time sometimes. You have to write to your own life. And the thing that cracked me up most about this poem was when it was being translated into Russian. And for some reason, Russian translations, American poems in Russian translations are difficult. The weirdest questions come up. And because I'm alive, you know, I couldn't email Camachi or Basho and say, now, did you really mean what I think you did? But I can be emailed, and I am. And so the Russian translator says, you know, I know that for you, chapsticks and tissues, you meant something cheap and throwaway. But in Russia, those things are still kind of expensive. And she kept proposing, what about if I made it, you know, a pocket comb? And I would say, no. And no, I don't think so. And I finally made conscious to myself, why was I so attracted to, you know, chapstick and tissues? It's because both of them are things you turn to. Your lips are chapped, you've been crying, or you have a cold. They are signals of our vulnerability. And not all is well with the world if you need your chapstick and your tissues. And she finally relented and said, oh, all right, my readers will probably understand that in America those things are cheap. So, all right, now I release you to the last light of the evening. Thank you so much for coming. And
Thank you,
listening.
Jane.